All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone for joining us from different locations. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Tanmay and I'm part of the developer community team. Today's session will provide the fundamentals of designing the architecting banking applications built on the Quantum platform. You will also learn the advantages and paradigms of different application channels, including responsive web, as well as native applications and even the wearables. So for this session, we have with us today Temenos expert Ed Gross, who's going to take you through design, development, prototyping, and user testing. If this is the first time that you've joined the webinar, there are a couple of things that you need to know. We have a Q&A panel available, which is active right now, so you can post your questions over there. Do not post on the chat window, and we'll make sure to give you answers as and when that is possible. We're also recording this webinar and it will be posted on Basecamp as a resource, so you can share it with your friends or colleagues later in case if they missed it today. That's it from my side. I would like to invite Ed to start. So let's start the session. Over to you, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining across the world. I know that it's a variety of different times around the world, and thank you for making the time today to participate in the Basecamp series of webinars that we're holding. My name is Ed Gross. I am lucky enough to head up a world-class team of both designers and developers around the world focused on designing and delivering world-class user experiences for the portfolio of Temenos products. Which includes applications, pre-built applications across all of our different functions, Infinity, Transact, as well as the underlying Quantum platform. So I'll jump right into it. Why is user experience so important? You know, we're hyper-focused on fintech, financial applications, and so specifically within the banking space, user experience is everything. It really is how you differentiate yourself from other financial institutions. There's been numerous studies, I'm citing just one of them here, but according to this study from 4C, 76% of users who have a great user experience either within a native application or an online banking experience are more likely to buy additional services. That's critical. Further, they're more likely to continue their relationship with the bank as opposed to leaving or moving their deposits elsewhere to either a challenger bank or a digital bank or a credit union. 86% are more likely to recommend the bank. That's the critical net promoter score. And then finally, 58% are more likely to trust the bank. These statistics are about a year and a half old. In the current situation that we find ourselves in with COVID, it's really, there is no more important and critical time to ensure that your users can easily perform all of the transactions that they need to have a good customer experience and keep their deposits within the financial institution. So what is it that we deliver within Temenos, just to give a background? So this team of UX professionals, user experience professionals, delivers applications, both native applications as well as online banking and even applications for wearable devices across the entire portfolio of banking. That covers retail, business banking for small and medium enterprises, as well as corporate banking, and then wealth management. All of these applications are consumer-facing and world-class out of the box and deliver an experience that consumers expect, as well as the entire gamut of functions that they expect as they perform their financial chores throughout their life cycle with the financial institutions. All of these are delivered on top of a consistent onboarding and origination process and set of APIs, a suite of digital servicing applications within the branch, payments functionality, and provides in-depth analytics, journey analytics, as well as CRM functions as well. So it's a broad set of functions, and as a UX team, we are expected to deliver on these expectations for both consumers and fintech professionals throughout the world. All of this is built on what we call the Quantum platform. This was the platform that we used as part of the Coney acquisition to deliver world-class experiences, again, for both native applications as well as web applications for any kind of device, any touch point, what we call down to the glass. We do that using a tool called Visualizer, and I'll touch upon this just briefly today in the context of delivering applications for whatever device that the user happens to be using, and delivering experiences that match best-in-class consumer experiences both within fintech and then outside of fintech. Users' expectations are very, very high as they adopt applications such as Uber, Amazon, you name it. They expect their banking applications to live up to those same experiences. So just to give a little bit of understanding of the differences between these different technologies. So when we talk about native applications, we're talking about applications that are purpose-built for specific operating systems and devices. The most common devices obviously today being Android and iOS in the mobile world. So those are our phones and our tablets, and then Windows as well, and Mac OS when we talk about PCs, or we talk about tablet devices as well. This uses a design paradigm known as adaptive design, meaning that the design, the experience, the journey really is very specific and purpose-built for the given channel. It is not a one-size-fits-all. It is more purpose-built for example, an iOS app uses very specific paradigms, which we'll get into, for those devices. An Android tablet application, for example, uses paradigms that are very specific for that particular form factor. That's what we call adaptive design. The technology that we use supports all of these capabilities, and as we design, we have to keep that thinking in mind. In addition to that, these native applications support a whole suite of technologies underneath the hood, such as machine learning, augmented reality, and personal assistants like Siri, for example. Those are just three examples in really an ocean of technologies that is constantly that the individual operating systems and providers of these devices are racing to differentiate themselves in the market with. And so taking advantage where appropriate with the user experience, taking advantage of those technologies is really critical. And it's why we choose, for example, to create a native application as opposed to sort of a one-size-fits-all web application. However, on the other side, with web applications, which have grown out of open standards, such as HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, they provide an accessible channel which leverages talent that you can find in abundance throughout the world to create applications that, as opposed to adaptive for native, are what we call responsive, meaning that they respond to the different form factors, really more from a sizing perspective across all what we call breakpoints for, whether it be a desktop channel, a tablet channel, a hybrid device, a mobile device, in some cases wearable devices, but really it's sort of a one-size-fits-all. The challenges there are that they don't really take advantage of most of the underlying technologies. They don't provide as fluid of an experience as native applications, but in a lot of cases, they are good enough for some of the things that you may want to do. They leverage technologies such as PWA, which is a new technology where you can essentially install that web application on what's called your Springboard and get that native-ish experience and it leverages technologies like WebSockets, for example, to provide a more fluid, local experience to your device that stores data on your device. And it feels like a native application, although it doesn't really live up to the same standard of a native application. At the end of the day, our technologies at Temenos using the Quantum platform supports both of these. So there are advantages of developing native applications, such as I mentioned, maximum performance, incredibly high transaction rates for B2C app experiences, especially when you have in the financial world a large number of transactions that you have to scroll through. For example, you leverage technologies like lazy loading and things like that. On the web side, obviously, it's very lightweight. When you develop an application, you host it on a server, host it in the cloud. So you don't have to go through the App Store submission process, which is an advantage. It is great for simple user experiences, as I had mentioned. With the Quantum platform, and we'll get into some of the underlying capabilities, we support both of these technologies. So when we develop applications, when we design applications, we design purposefully for each of these channels using the underlying visualizer low-code toolset, which really provides an advantage because we can really custom build and tailor these experiences for each channel, but we can at the same time leverage common components or common user experiences across both. So what kind of experiences do we develop with the platform? So we develop very purposefully applications, which you're seeing on my screen here. This is an example of retail banking applications purpose-built for native. So we design applications very specifically for mobile that leverage all the great capabilities that we have. Things like Touch ID, biometrics, Face ID, for example, very dynamic, gesture-driven user experiences like what you see here. All the navigation paradigms leveraging the underlying guidelines of the iOS and Android operating systems. Again, this is what we call adaptive design, more of a screen-by-screen flow through the application. Later on in this presentation, we'll compare and contrast the experience on native as opposed to a web-based experience. And then utilizing the same components underneath the hood, we're able to develop dynamic experiences for tablet as well. And you'll notice that we're leveraging a lot of the same experiences without having to rewrite the entire application. This is a fundamental capability of the underlying platform. You can see it's a very smooth, high performance experience. I'm able to rapidly scroll through all of my different transactions. I can see iconography associated with the type of transactions. Those are just some of the design paradigms that we built into the native applications as well as the web applications to really help the user get visual cues and manage their expenses and manage their financial life throughout their journey. This is an example of one of our customers. This is Partners Federal Credit Union, which is the federal credit union or the bank of the Disney employees, or what they call the cast members. Some of the things they've done are they've taken this out of the box application, and with our design team, they've extended it to include things like a card-based user experience for what they call relationship rewards, which is a loyalty program. This gives you an example of how our customers work with us from a design perspective to custom tailor a very specific portion of their application, which is the dashboard, to offer up information and context-specific information, including those relationship rewards as well as a global contextual search, and very specific targeted marketing. In this case, financial education that's very much associated with the umbrella Disney brand of, as you can see here, Star Wars. So a great example of how our customers can take it using the visualizer, the underlying visualizer platform, extend it to really tailor it to their brand and their market. When we design applications with the Quantum platform, we take inspiration from not only financial applications, but applications, in this case, you're seeing a healthcare application that was developed using the same platform, using a whole slew of native capabilities, dynamic, gesture-driven, search indexing, very fluid, location-based mapping, for example. Another example is a media application, and this example is a large satellite provider that you may have heard of. And you can see here that we have very fluid management of very, very large data sets. In this case, a media guide with both vertical and horizontal scrolling. That's very much a capability of the underlying native ecosystem, something that you couldn't necessarily create using just a web technology. And then the final example here is from our own retail banking application, and this shows you how we can get very dynamic, what we call native interaction design. So I have this paginated scrolling as I go from left to right. You can see these cards and opacity and transformations. I can get very, very technical and sort of geek out on this subject quite a bit, but this is again something that is all three of these examples show you the capabilities of the underlying native applications, and these design considerations, again, when we consider native adaptive design, we think about as we design our banking applications. These are sort of the expectations of users. So your users expect a very fluid, native feeling application, and they may not be able to tell you exactly why they like these native experiences better, but they know when they're using a native application versus a sort of hybrid web application, or what we call a wrapper. Some other considerations to get very specific that we consider when we design native applications, and this is pretty informative. When you're holding whether you're left-handed or right-handed, when you're holding a mobile device, we try to incorporate the most important functions within the area that you can reach with one hand. And you'll see that a lot of the most popular applications in the world, whether those are financial applications or applications in retail, healthcare, transportation, what have you, are taking a lot of these best practices into consideration. A lot of folks, for example, are moving away from the hamburger menu, for example, on Android, and they're starting to move that navigation to the bottom of the screen, specifically because those functions, and Facebook is a great example of this, those functions are those functions that you can reach while holding your device and using only your thumb. Whereas if you're doing a more advanced transaction like a search, for example, using an application like Zillow, you're probably going to be using both hands. You're going to be holding the device with one hand and then using your finger to drill down into the detail. So there's different examples of when you'd want to use each of those paradigms. In addition to that, there are very specific capabilities and paradigms of each of the underlying operating systems, such as Face ID and Touch ID for both iOS and Android, as well as very specific what we call widget systems and interactions in those underlying operating systems. And so the Quantum platform gives us the capabilities to tailor this very specifically to those operating systems without even thinking about it. The default kind of alert box that you see here on the right will surface for this specific device without me, the developer or the designer, having to think about what the specific paradigm is. The visualizer platform takes care of a lot of that for me. When we're designing our underlying retail banking applications, for example, we design them with configurability in mind. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of applications are moving away from that hamburger experience, which you see on the left, but we offer both for both platforms. So it's entirely configurable. So this is really another consideration as you're designing applications. And this is something that our team takes into account with every application, is that we make this as configurable and we provide that optionality for our customers. So if they want to leverage a quote unquote hamburger menu for Android, and they want to leverage what we call the navigation bar at the bottom, they could, for iOS, for example, they can do that. The platform provides the native widget systems with all of the form-to-form screen transitions underneath the hood, so that the user doesn't have to recreate all of those experiences. And this, at the end of the day, what that means for your users is that when they open that application and they navigate through it, they get that native experience and all of the nuance associated with it. And a lot of that, experience is subconscious, as I mentioned before. It gives them just an overall better feeling about that experience. Some other examples of that include things like quick actions and action sheets. These are examples for Android and iPhone devices where on the left, you'll see what we call an action sheet for iOS, and the similar paradigm for Android. Again, this is offered as part of the platform, and is adaptive. We designed this with the specific user experience paradigms in mind. When a user is navigating through an experience on iOS or Android, they expect these very specific contextual actions. So if they're deleting something, for example, in a messaging application, they expect these different paradigms. In iOS, it's the swipe to delete. In Android, it's the contextual action sheet that you see here, and it's almost muscle memory. So it's very important to develop and to design these experiences that are tailored to the user's expectations, because if you don't, then they may do something and they may make a mistake in an application, and they may get frustrated because it doesn't follow the experience that they're used to with every single application on their device. So switching over to web, that was a pretty broad coverage of the kind of things we think about when we are developing native applications. At the same time, we also deliver out-of-the-box experiences for banking for responsive web, for the modern web. And you can see here an example of that for native web applications built for retail banking. This is the dashboard and account details for our out-of-the-box Infinity retail banking application. And it has parity with every other online banking application that you would see out there, and delivers a very different experience than native. We're presenting more information on a single screen. We're using things like the accordion paradigms to get to my transaction details, tab-based experiences, as opposed to form-to-form transitions or that adaptive design experience that we talked about earlier. So that was retail banking. We also deliver similar experiences for small business across both responsive web and native. And so this really kind of shows you that we have to deliver a bespoke experience for web and a bespoke experience for native, but we have to have parity in terms of functionality across both of those channels. You can see here how the same experience is delivered for different breakpoints, right? So this is the same application that you're seeing on the left for mobile as you are on the right for a laptop or a desktop monitor. And the difference is that we deliver a more compact experience that is responsive, so that when you launch your online banking experience from a mobile browser as opposed to a desktop browser, you're able to perform all of the same functions that you can see here, but it's presented in a very single column type of flow. As we move through these different breakpoints, we also may remove certain functions from the mobile experience, so it's hyper-focused, and there's less room for error as you're trying to do something a little bit more complex, like complete a money transfer between accounts or pay a person, for example. This shows you side by side, again, a comparison of, on the left, a responsive web application, and then on the right, the same exact experience for native. So we've seen the native experience across all the different devices. We've seen responsive web. This shows you very specifically the experience for web. As I resize the browser, you can see how the form factor completely changes. And then that same exact experience, that same dashboard on native. And the experience is quite a bit different, where for native, you're seeing here that as I drill into an account and I see my transactions, I'm transitioning from one form to another, as opposed to responsive web. It's all delivered on a single form layout, and I'm using an accordion paradigm to drill into the details of each of those transactions. Responsive web applications, using the underlying tooling, we make very easy to build using these visual, what we call low-code tools. So you can see here within the Quantum platform, I'm able to switch between different breakpoints and visually see how the responsive web application for online banking changes, and how it goes from, for example, a 3-column layout to a 2-column layout for tablet, and then a 1-column layout for mobile. And what I do is I just tailor only those things that I want to change between those different breakpoints, so that I don't have to redesign the entire experience for each breakpoint. A designer can do this without having to rely necessarily on a developer to create the responsive specific design. I can get real-time feedback and then test that application in real time. So an example of how we create an experience specifically for responsive web, and then how that compares to a native application. And we're going to take an example of, in this case, money movement. So transferring money between, in this case, between accounts, either within a bank or between two different financial institutions. So this is a responsive web example for desktop, and you can see that all of the fields are presented on a single screen. For that same application on web, as we had shown earlier in the video, if it wasn't clear, we're presenting that same information but stacked in a single column, and we're removing certain functions from that experience so the user's not confused and they're able to efficiently complete that transaction. So we're eliminating that quick action bar that you see on the right for desktop. This is sort of just the basics of responsive web design. Everything that we do is designed first, meaning that we create the user experience using tools like Sketch and Envision before we ever touch the platform or the code. It is design-led so that we understand, and we actually test this in a prototype fashion before we ever touch development, so that we can identify user experience deficiencies or struggles that the user is having before we go into development, where it's much more expensive to fix. Now let's contrast that with native, or what we call adaptive design. This is an example of doing that same exact function, but on a mobile device. And you can see here that I'm transitioning between 4 different forms. And that feels very natural when you're using a native application, where you're touching the source account, the recipient account, or the recipient person, the amount, you see a summary, and then you complete the transaction. So you're doing this through touch, and it automatically transitions as you touch each of those rows or enter each of those amounts and press continue. That's a very natural experience on a mobile device, but it's very different than a field by field chooser for web. And this is a great example of how we custom tailor, we rigorously test these different experiences across these different form factors to make sure that users are getting the best possible experience for the given form factor. So that's how we design what we call the out-of-the-box infinity suite of applications with, in this case, a focus on retail banking. To give some examples of how our customers take it sort of to the next level, you can see here an example of a customer who's using very fluid, what we call vector animation, using some more advanced features of the Quantum platform, and specifically the visualizer platform, to do things like vector animation and provide a chat-based experience to onboard customers using the native application. This is a great example of how you would use the native device using things like photo capture or signature, for example, on the device, things you couldn't do just using a web browser necessarily, to provide a complete experience end-to-end to onboard a customer, open an account, and even fund the account without having to switch back and forth between channels, or even worse, call someone at the financial institution. And in this case, another example similar to Partners Federal Credit Union. In this case, this is a credit union in Pennsylvania in the United States that has taken the dashboard and completely customized it for their consumers. It includes a greeting at the top of the screen. It includes some PFM metrics, some spending metrics in this case, some examples of purchases that the user can expand and contract, as well as there's a set of most recent transactions. So they've really sort of taken the dashboard experience and really customized it and tailored it to their user base. Whether you're designing native applications or web applications, we have a common component system underneath the hood that we carry through all the way through the design process. So as we do our analysis of applications, both single applications across form factors, such as retail banking, across both native and web channels, as well as across different applications in the portfolio, such as retail banking, for example, small and medium enterprise, wealth, et cetera, we have a common component system that is used across all of those. And I'm not going to drill down into every detail of this. It's a bit of an eye chart here, but this shows you an example. If we look at the modular components column here, this shows you, this is an example of how we design common functions across all of these in an atomic fashion. What does that mean? That means starting with things like when a user enters an identifier, such as in the United States, for example, such as Social Security or gender, or does facial recognition, we design that in a common fashion across both native and web. Those atomic components are used in larger, what we call business components with contracts that are used across both within an application in multiple instances or multiple user journeys, but also across different applications. A good example of that is if I'm developing a payment application and I'm developing a retail banking application, I may utilize the same new user onboarding flow, and I also may utilize the same origination flow and the same card management flow across both of those. What this means is that I'm designing in a consistent fashion, whether it's for web or native, and I'm utilizing the same business functionality so that the maintenance of this application does not have to be, we don't have to maintain those same components across all these different business use cases. All of these components are built using a singular, what we call client model, uses the same virtual app data model, which is then mapped to the backend systems of record, whether that's the Temenos Transact core banking, other core banking systems, card management, loan origination, et cetera. I'm going to close out by talking a little bit about the design process to bring it back from the technology to the design process that we utilize. regardless of what we're designing, whether we're designing a native application for retail or we're designing a web application for wealth management, for example, we follow the exact same process. And this is critical so that we meet the expectations of the persona, of the market that we're delivering for. This all starts with empathy, learning about your audience, constructing a point of view based on the specific needs of the users for that market or region. This is especially critical when we're delivering between different markets. It's especially critical when we're delivering for banks that are going more and more digital and moving away from in-person banking, especially in this time of need. We work with our customers in the ideation process to brainstorm and come up with creative solutions to very complex problems. Things like money movement, things like management of accounts across different financial institutions. We prototype and test. This is critical. Before we ever get into engineering, we prototype and test. We ideate, prototype, and test. And these processes are iterative. So there is no one time. We iterate through this process throughout the life cycle of the application in an agile fashion. So we don't ever pretend to get it right the first time and hand over to engineering and just hope it turns out good. We test this with users during the design process to ensure that we meet those expectations. If we look at this in more detail, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we have very specific what we call gates as we move through any design process. So as we design something, it is reviewed from a content perspective. It is reviewed from an accessibility perspective. It's prototyped. We analyze the results, and you can see here it's a little bit hard to read, but especially in this middle section here, we excuse me, we iterate through this process and we prototype and we test before we ever deliver. If you look at the on the right, before we ever deliver to the engineering team. There's a number of tools that assist with this process. We happen to use the Atlassian suite of products. We use tools like Sketch and Envision from a design perspective, but we don't short circuit this process. And this is really the crux of this, is that we don't just go from a phone call to a design and then hand it over to engineering. It's critical that we follow a consistent process so that our design is consistent, our user experience and journeys meet the expectations of the personas that we're delivering for. So as we develop this process, it's very important to define first who our personas are. Who is going to be using this application? We design for users. We do not design for engineers. We do not design for ourselves. We design for the specific personas of the users that are in the market that we're delivering for, whether that's a retail banking application in the US, or for example, a wealth application in Central Europe. The motivations, goals, fears, personality, influences, they're going to differ depending on the application, depending on the market that we're serving. And you can see here, this is a very good example of a persona that we've had to deliver for some very specific markets. In this case, it's a person who is in California, has a fundamental education, and then we understand what their personality is. This helps as we do what we call empathy mapping. We use that persona to define goals, understand senses, and empathize with those emotions. This may seem like, sort of like marketing, high-level information that may not help, but it's actually extremely informative in the empathy mapping process to define then from here what we call our journey maps. So once we develop those personas, we then go on to create a journey map of an experience before we even start drawing an enhanced user experience. Before we ever take pen to paper, we we try to define the journey map. This is an example of a journey map of a sort of subpar experience, where, in this case, as this persona, Casey, is enrolling for an account in a bank, she has to go through a number of arduous steps, which includes talking to someone at the bank, potentially visiting a bank branch, which is not a feasible experience, especially during this time, having to log on to their mobile application multiple times, having to go back and forth and install an app. And this helps inform us where the pain points are, for example, in the current process. We then map that against an expedited process, in this case, a mobile experience where the user only has to go through 4 or 5 steps, as opposed to those multiple touch points that you saw earlier. And we test this with real users to ensure that the experience is optimal, that they're going through as few steps as possible, going back to adaptive design and responsive web design, that we're delivering on the most optimal channel for that particular user journey. So in the case of enrollment or origination, we're delivering, in this example, either on a native app or a responsive web app to be as accessible as possible for that new user. And finally, what we do is we use a lot of user data that starts with testing. So we use data to inform what types of form factors we should be delivering for. We test the application to understand for the specific audiences where they're having troubles. We tailor our testing for very specific demographics. One good example of that is we're not going to test a retail banking application with someone who works for a bank. That would be a very bad experience because that user will be very biased, and they will have a very different set of expectations. They'll be much more advanced. We test those applications with an audience appropriate. Another example of that is wealth. We're not going to test a wealth management application for someone who is just starting out with banking. If we're developing wealth management applications, we need to tailor it very specifically for the demographics that have somewhat more complex needs. Here's a great example of some data that we use every day. 1/3 of all smartphone users, for example, use their banking app more than any other app. So the user experience has to be extraordinarily efficient. It has to be accessible, and it has to be enjoyable because they're spending a lot of time within that application. I'm not going to go through every single one of these statistics, but these statistics are very helpful. More and more users expect to complete every single type of transaction. And I mean every type of transaction, either partially or completely using a digital channel. That includes things like loan origination, retail banking, wealth management, business banking, and the list goes on. They don't want to have to call someone. They don't want to have to interact with a person if they can more efficiently complete that experience using either a native mobile application or a responsive web application. So I'll round this out with just, we don't have time in this call to go through all the user research methods that we deploy, but there's a lot that, from a user experience perspective, that we do, again, before we ever, put pen to paper, before we ever, start develop, we don't race to develop an application. We use things like user interviews, ethnography, card sorting, A/B testing. A/B testing is critical to understand and to validate whether experience A or experience B results in a higher adoption rate or a higher completion rate in the case of something like onboarding, for example. And finally, as we mentioned, we do a lot of usability testing. That usability testing is critical for us, whether it's in the design phase or whether it's in once an application has been developed, using things like instrumentation to understand the performance and the adoption rate of that application to iterate and improve upon that process. Okay, so that's all I had for today. I believe we are actually under time, which I was not expecting. So thank you everyone for hanging on. We have a few questions coming in through the chat here, so I'll try to answer all of them if we have time. The first question is coming from Catherine. So why create native applications? And a follow-up to that question is, what is the advantage of maintaining separate source code instead of just creating a single hybrid application? So I'll try to answer that succinctly. As I mentioned, there are expectations of users when it comes to financial applications or any other type of application out there. They expect a very fluid experience. And again, I mentioned that they may not be able to articulate why they enjoy a certain user experience, especially when it comes to native applications, but they will tell you that one experience is better than the other. So that they do understand, and I wouldn't underestimate your users. Especially important in this competitive environment where everything has gone digital. We're all at home. We're all trying to complete financial transactions and manage our finances through a digital-only channel. It is critical that you deliver a world-class experience that is custom-tailored for the channel that the customer is using. And don't compromise on a sort of one-size-fits-all hybrid application. That's critically important because users will know the difference. They will gravitate towards experiences that are better. There's a lot of emerging fintechs out there that are stealing wallet share specifically because they have a great user experience and that their users can complete any financial transaction on that channel. So while it may create some additional overhead, and some of that additional overhead may be overcome by using a common component layer, a common design system, using the Temenos tool sets, including Quantum and other tool sets within Temenos. Some of that may be mitigated. It still is the user experience outcomes and the customer retention outcomes are more important than the maintenance issues. I have another question here. Is there a demo for the corporate banking application? I would reach out to your local sales representative or your partner that you're working with to get some insight into corporate banking. Got another question here. How long is the learning curve of a tool like Visualizer? Like anything, requires obviously a learning curve. We've tried to make the process of learning very iterative. There's a number of tools that we have, including within Visualizer, tools that help you learn along the way using inline examples. And these are all available on Basecamp. Things like hikes and articles, video tutorials. There's a whole host of resources out there for you to onboard with the Visualizer and Quantum tool sets. But it's anywhere from a week to a month. But just like any other tool, it probably takes a long time to master, especially when you get into some of the more nuanced capabilities like native interaction design, for example. So it's easy to get started with, but just like anything, it does take some time to master. Got another question here. For the Infinity online banking app, what is the design stance on opening new tabs versus using iframes? That's really a case-by-case basis. We try to avoid using iframes whenever possible, mostly because we don't have control over, if we're opening, for example, a bill pay application that's provided by another vendor, which is a real example. we don't really have control over that user experience. And what we don't want to do is have a compromised user experience nested within a different user experience. Opening up and having an iframe also represents accessibility issues. It's sort of a no-no in the web content accessibility guidelines world to open up an iframe, because the user may have to do horizontal scrolling within vertical scrolling. So you have what's called a double page scroll, which violates a lot of the acceptance criteria of the WCAG 2.1 standard for responsive web. So iframes are sort of going the way of the dodo, so to speak. So it's really a case-by-case basis, and you really have to understand the use case. You also don't want to break things like single sign-on. So if you're within a single sign-on experience, you don't want to break that. So if you do open a new tab, you want to ensure that you maintain that session. So there's a lot of considerations there that, when we're developing a user experience, it's not just about, this is a great example, it's not just about drawing boxes and developing a UI. It's about creating an experience that is seamless and fluid, and thinking about things like single sign-on, and thinking about things like accessibility and performance, so we're not breaking that user's experience and resulting in adoption fall off or abandonment of the application, and God forbid, even worse, a potential security issue. So with iframes and tabs, there's a lot of considerations that you have to think about from a security perspective as well. Another question, are these quantum applications integrated to Temenos T24 core banking to fetch real-time data from T24? Of course, yes. The entire Infinity suite of applications is integrated with Transact, which is the new name for T24. So all of those are integrated via a microservices layer into Transact, but they are also ready to integrate with any number of different core banking applications, Fiserv, for example, Scimitar. So our customers integrate or expect to integrate with their core banking systems, which may or may not be the Temenos core banking suite. Obviously, we love Transact, and we believe it's the best core banking platform on the planet, and we always are obviously ready to integrate with whatever function Transact offers up and offer that to consumers. But we also are mindful of the fact that our customers use a variety of different core banking or other financial applications that we are obligated to integrate with. Another question here, if I want to convert iOS design to iPad design, does Visualizer have an option to automatically create an adaptive design? The short answer to that is yes and no. You wouldn't want to just convert a user experience from phone to tablet. What you'd want to do is you'd want to leverage the real estate for tablet more effectively for those particular components. So a good example of that is transaction list and transaction detail. On a mobile device, you would have a transaction list on one form and the transaction detail on another form. On an iPad, you may want to present both of those components on a single form. So you would use the Visualizer component layer to leverage those same components across those two different form factors. It's a very common use case, and it's how we build our applications within Infinity. That being said, the Visualizer system, the layout system, which is called Flex Layout, gives you the capability to adapt to those different form factors. So there's no need to convert. What you do is you standardize on common components that you just drop into those different forms for mobile and forms for tablet. It's not a one-button conversion, and it's important because we're not designing for engineers to have a one-click solution. We're designing, it may take a little bit of additional incremental effort to design for tablet, but it's important to be mindful of the user experience for tablet. Another good example of that is when you're designing for tablet, you may be designing for both portrait and landscape. Whereas for mobile, you're typically only designing for portrait, especially for a banking application, for native. Another question here. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat here. Is any solution available for corporate and wealth? Yes. As we had shown earlier, we have solutions for corporate banking and for wealth management. Some of those applications are custom, are built purposefully just for responsive. Some are built for both, for example. Another question, is the solution / code base the same for mobile and web? Yes and no. The UI is actually separate, and that's by design. So the web design, as we had shown earlier in some very specific examples, is actually, again, bespoke for web, whereas the native design is adaptive. So you have your responsive design and your adaptive design for native applications. However, they share a lot of the same what are called business controllers, which contains the business logic. They share the same object model. They share the same mappings and mapping templates to the backend core banking systems. So they do share a lot, but very specifically underneath the hood, the UI is maintained separately, and that's by design. Another question here, what is the difference between Temenos Quantum and DBX? I'm actually going to switch back to a very specific slide that illustrates this. So DBX is not a term that we use anymore. That was a legacy Coney term, and you may hear me slip sometimes and use the word DBX, but it's really Infinity. So the Infinity suite of applications, which I covered here, including retail banking, business banking, corporate banking, and wealth management, are built on top of the Quantum platform for both native and web. So the Infinity suite of applications used to be called, at least a subset of them used to be called DBX. That term is no longer used. We refer to this as Infinity Digital Banking. Those applications are built on the Quantum platform. So they're designed and developed on the Quantum platform, which includes the Nitro framework, which is sort of the secret sauce underneath the hood, which leverages all of the native capabilities of the operating systems, the UI device capabilities. And then the tools that are part of the platform include the IDE, which is the design environment to design the UI and write your business logic on the client side, which is Visualizer. And then Fabric, which is used to build the integration layer and the microservices which connect to your backend systems. So this gives you sort of a stack diagram of the difference between what used to be called DBX, which are the applications built on top of the Quantum platform. I have another question here. How flexible is the UX for the out-of-the-box Infinity applications? I'm going to assume that this question means how flexible how much can you customize or configure the user experience specific for the customer, the bank or the credit union. It is very flexible, actually. So with that being said, there are also best practices. So when we're talking about things like the dashboard, for example, and I'll actually pull up a very specific example here. So this is a great example on this slide of a customer that has customized the dashboard of the retail banking mobile native application. This is a great example of something that we advocate that our customers over time, maybe not with the initial go live of the application, but over time, tailor and customize to their user base. And the reason I say not initially is you really want to try and go live and get value out of the box Infinity applications as quickly as possible, and then learn from your market, learn from instrumentation that we provide, learn from the analytics and Fabric and Journey Analytics, the former Avoca product. Learn how users are onboarding, the functions that they're using with the applications, the areas that they may be struggling with, and the capabilities that you may want to introduce, the capabilities that they're asking for. And that's exactly what PSECU did. They customized the dashboard. They included a custom spending chart, like we talked about earlier. They included a FICO score. They customized their greeting at the top of the screen. However, things that we really don't advocate changing are things like money movement. And the reason why is we've done just a ton of testing with users. We've done a ton of tailoring of this particular workflow. And so this is the last question I'll answer because we're kind of running over time here. But I really do want to stress the point that there are areas of the application that you're going to get a lot of return on investment by customizing. Things like the welcome experience, the branding, the dashboard. Customizing things like money movement. We've done a lot of testing. We've made this process very efficient for all the different channels. So this is an area where the cost of making a change to this just because you prefer it is going to result in a lot of testing, a lot of overhead of this particular workflow. So I'll stop there. We are over time. So again, I thank you for joining. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out on Basecamp or reach out to me directly. Again, appreciate everyone joining and taking the time. Hopefully this was insightful for everyone that joined, and I look forward to continuing designing great applications and developing unique user experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed, for your session. It was really, really great with amazing few user experiences and examples you shared with us. I want to thank the entire audience today for joining us. As I said in the beginning, this webinar is recorded and it'll be available on Basecamp for you to listen to it again, or in case if you want to share it with your friends. The remaining questions, we'll make sure we'll post it on Basecamp and make that available to you. In case if anything is not answered, you can use Basecamp forum and post your questions. We'll tag Ed Gross and other experts as well, and give you answers in Basecamp forum as well. So make use of that. There is also, visit the Basecamp events page, and we have a next webinar on 23rd of June this month. Make sure you register to that, and keep visiting that because we record the webinars, and you can even get the list of all the webinars we have done so far. Just one slide I want to share before I go. So this one is the new webinar, which is on 23rd of July. And make sure you register by going to basecamp.temenos.com/s/events page. The recording will be available on the same page, the same webinar, and you can access it again. Thanks so much. We hope to see you again in the next webinar. Take care. Bye.